the number one thing I think that people get wrong and misunderstand about the shoulder is that the shoulder is meant to move, which is ironically something that is taught in a lot of anatomy classes. It's taught in a lot of universities, but somewhere, some time along the way, a lot of certifications have started to talk about restricting scapular movement, or even just really focusing on the scapula in any other way than, hey, just let this thing move and let the collarbone move and let both of those things do their job. The shoulder can move in all which ways, right? So it can move, a good angle here might be to start with from behind. The shoulder can move in elevation depression, right? And notice that, obviously these two things are connected, the humerus to the scapula, both by tons of different muscles, the rotator cuff, just to name a couple, as well as all different kinds of muscles that come in up from the neck and from the spine that sort of connect, the rhomboids run into the serratus, which runs all the way on the ribs, which ultimately moves this in tandem with the humerus. All these things are very closely interconnected, and although there are a ton of muscles, there are a ton of ligaments, there are a ton of soft tissues, non-contractile tissues that really hold this thing together, or at least try their best to do so. But because this thing is so mobile, because it moves, I don't want to block this view, because it moves in so many different directions, because it upwardly rotates, downwardly rotates, elevates, depresses, retracts, right, this way, protracts this way, right, all of these joint actions are sort of interspersed and interconnected in that whenever the scapula moves, there's a sort of concomitant amount of motion that occurs at the clavicle here, whether it be in more of an elevation type way or more of a protraction type way. Hopefully that's easy to see, right? And I won't dislocate Frank's shoulder here, right? Protraction being this motion, retraction the opposite, elevation, depression, maybe just from a different angle, and all sorts of things in between, right? So when I'm doing presses, when I'm doing pulls, I am to let this scapula, I am to let this clavicle move. I am to allow these things to elevate and depress as I'm doing pull downs. I need to be able to control joint motions. I need to be able to control all of these different joint actions, not just passively allowing myself to flop around with heavier weights, right? But under control, under a circumstance where I'm controlling the motion with contractile tissue. I'm not allowing myself to get smushed into various joint positions. So one of the things that seems to bother people most are things like presses and things like raises, like lateral raises, right, where we're dealing with a very high amount of force, obviously, at the shoulder, but in positions that tend to be compromising positions for people, right? So the bottom of a press tends to be an area where people, either allow their shoulder to roll forward, which, you may think of as motion, right? But it's not the kind of motion that we want, right? At the bottom of a press, just to give an example, it's like if we're in the bottom of a press, we want this scapula to be retracted to the amount that it needs to be, this angle here, right? And so that when we go to press forward, we can kind of let go of that and then now and allow this natural rhythm of the scapula to move from this elevated retracted position to this more, slightly more upwardly rotated, protracted position at the end of the press, right? In a pull down, we need to be able to go through the motions of, okay, well, I'm going to allow my shoulder blade to elevate the necessary amount, assuming that, again, the shoulder blade motion is my goal, which hopefully it is. And as I go through this pull down here, and as I actually bring my humerus now closer to my body, that relative elevation is going to quickly move toward depression. And right, a press would just be the same thing in an opposite direction. So in either case, it's all the same joint motions, right? It's all elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, upward and downward rotation of the shoulder girdle, as well as flexion, extension, abduction, adduction of the arm, in tandem with some of the rotation stuff, right? But ultimately, all of these joint actions are the same in terms of, like, if I'm doing, an elevation depression type motion, that could be a pull down where the load is pulling me up in this way, and I'm going through, the motion of, whatever, a more sagittal plane thing. But it could also be the opposite, again, where I'm using the exact same arm path, but now I'm actually going through a press and I just have the load direction reversed. So the major key here is to allow your shoulder to move, and really mostly to understand where it should be moving in what joint positions, okay? So this may be the more practical, valuable part of the video for you all, which is that when we are, let's say, starting with any kind of pressing, right? If the arm is more, in line / behind the body, right? What we oftentimes see at the bottom of a press, which is something I alluded to earlier, is the scapula kind of gets stuck here for whatever reason, and the shoulder keeps kind of going, and now we lose a lot of the structural support, right? This doesn't look too good. that we have at the shoulder, right? From a muscular standpoint, from a connective tissue end range standpoint, and so on and so forth. So what we need to sort of force to happen to some degree, if it's not necessarily natural to us, is we need to allow this retraction to happen, right? Hopefully this is a better angle where this scapula can actually move inward and upward as I come backward. So not many people, just as a short caveat, know that retraction is actually an inward and upward motion, right? So it's this kind of downward tipping elevation in addition to the moving closer to the spine. Right, so in a press, there should be, if I'm in this fully retracted position, there should be some degree of that elevation, some degree of that coordinative feeling around your traps in that bottom end of the range. So again, retraction at the bottom of a press. As I go through the press, I'm really not focused on where this is going. I'm just focused on pushing the load forward, because the scapula, again, assuming I'm allowed to move, which I should be, because if I try to maintain this retraction and I come forward with the arm, which again would be impossible to some degree, right, I'm basically going to lose a lot of the structural support that this thing would otherwise have provided. So allow retraction to happen, and even maybe force it a little bit if you are someone that tends to, tilt more toward this forward shoulder posture. On the way back on the press, allow it to relax however you want. When you're doing a row, as you reach forward and as you come to the eccentric portion of the motion, right, the load is pulling you this way, right? Allow the scapula and as well as the clavicle, right, this big guy over here, to drift forward with the load. Allow the shoulder blade motion to happen. We don't need to round our spines over for that to be the case, right? We can just allow this to naturally come forward wherever it's comfortable. And then when we're pulling back, if we're pulling more down, maybe we think more of a depression type of intent for more of a lat type thing, or maybe we think more out, right, where the plane of retraction, i.e. this plane here, where the arm would maybe be more in line with this sort of transverse thing, the scapula will move a little bit naturally more, and I'll get some more of that retraction. So I could just allow my shoulder blade to move forward and pull wherever I'm comfortable to pulling, and assuming that I'm not doing this sort of a thing as I'm pulling, I'm allowing my shoulder blades, or I'm forcing my shoulder blades to kind of get back and upward, as I mentioned in the case of the press. In the case of a pull down now, right, allowing ourselves to do a very similar thing where we actually allow this elevation and protraction thing to happen as I'm going through a pull down motion, and I'm then sort of reverse actioning that as I come down, pulling down toward my hip, or maybe it's a pull down where I'm pulling, I'm allowing the load to pull me up, but then I'm pulling a little bit wider, I'm allowing that retraction to happen. And then as I go through any raising type motion, so we covered pushes, pulls, and whatnot in various directions, if I'm going through any raising type motion, I simply just need to allow this upward rotation type of motion to happen, right? So we see that a lot of this bottom portion of the range, there's not much scapular motion here, right? But as soon as I start to get to about 90, 100 degrees, what will happen inevitably is this bony structure will run out of room, and I will need to, if I can get this rotation right real quick, I will need to upwardly rotate this scapula, right? And to such a degree, eventually, that this is really not a perfect representation, but the arm would probably need to be somewhere around here, just forgetting about that this is a dead guy that I'm holding, right? So the scapula would need to upwardly rotate to such a degree, right, where it would be able to actually support and sort of buttress the bottom of the humerus, right? And the same would be true with any kind of pull-in motion. I would need to really let this move up and outward, again, assuming I'm not covering too much of it, before I were to move down. So the general point here being, allow your shoulder blades to move in the directions that they need to move. Allow your collarbone to move in the direction that it needs to move, along with the humerus. So I tend to take the humerus first approach, the scapula second, meaning if I'm thinking about cueing anything, I'm thinking about cueing the direction of the upper arm. And if I'm thinking about the direction of the upper arm and my intent is to allow the shoulder blades to move as much as they need to in any particular scenario, again, pairing those things that we already talked about, extension with this more retraction-based thing, flexion with this more protraction, upward rotation-based thing, depression with this more downward rotation, elevation with this more upward rotation, elevation, all those things, as long as you're pairing those things together, you are allowing these structures to do what they're supposed to, which is to move together. And as a consequence, all of the muscles that coordinate that motion and control basically the stability of this joint, which is a very mobile one, obviously, are able to actually stay within a length that they're capable of producing tons of force in, which at the end of the day, in my estimation, will keep you safer. So hopefully this was helpful. I know this was a lot more jargon maybe than my typical videos, and I went kind of quickly through some things. So So definitely let me know if you have any questions about this in terms of just to clarifying the different kinds of motions. But again, the major key here, let your shoulder blade move, stop holding it in places, stop overly focusing on it when there are cases where you actually don't need to. A majority of people, I personally find, really only need to control or think about actively controlling their shoulder blades in a few scenarios, and those scenarios over time tend to dissipate in terms of the necessity to think and to cue and so on and so forth.